You're the type of hero who casts no shadow. Your great deeds never seeing the light of day.
A spy radio! Sending secret messages!
To Falcon and Reineck, emergency operation from Twilight.
Spy Family is an anime that really doesn't need much of an introduction, both from its insane rise in popularity, but also because its concept is a class in strong simplicity. The premise centers around the legendary spy codenamed Twilight, who's tasked with his hardest job yet: to assume the identity of Loid Forger and start a perfect fake family. This is because his target, Donovan Desmond, is a famous recluse only appearing at prestigious school events for his son, and so Loid needs to have a child who can attend those events. And in a parody of Cold War East Germany, you can't have a kid without a wife. That wouldn't be very ideal citizen of you. This leads him to Anya, unknown to him a telepath, and Yor, unknown to him an assassin. And so we witness as all three live together in a comedic web of lies, each with their own secrets, as a gathering of convenience becomes a happy little family life. Despite being a humorous and at times outlandish spy adventure, the series setting of Westalis and Ostania provides little secret as to the place and time being parodied. Through all the anachronisms and laughs, we can see many scenes crafted with a genuine interest for the history which inspired them. Whether it's Yor and the pressures placed on women during the Cold War, Yuri and the chilling reality of the Stasi, which his job parodies, or today's topic of Loid and some of the genuine espionage tactics incorporated into the anime, there's a lot to discuss. I originally planned one single video, but as I was compiling my notes, I realized it would be a disservice to try and cram so much history into just one video. So, as always, show this video some love to help boost it with the almighty algorithm, and let me know if you're interested in more, and we'll cover those other two topics as well. And please do really help this one do well. Those topics are things that I've been interested in and dying to discuss forever, since me and my father, who actually served in Germany during the Cold War, watched the wonderful Deutschland 83 series, which shows us the opposite end of things from Spy Family, a forced East German spy making his first journey to the West and coming to terms with a reality he never even knew existed. I'll be using a few clips from that series to help supplement here, and if you want more on these topics, you should definitely check it out. But more on topic for today, let's return to Loid, the head of the definitely not ironically named Forger family. Now, in a series with telepath children who go on castle amusement park adventures with her forged spy father playing a TV spy and assassin mother, you probably aren't expecting much of the espionage to be rooted in reality. But there's something about the Cold War which lessens this. It was kind of f***ing wild. Amidst the genuine tensions of a nuclear-driven arms race, millions were spent behind the scenes on gathering, storing, and transporting information in any and every way possible. With the stakes at an all-time high, anything and everything was tried to get an edge on an enemy who was doing the same thing. To show just how crazy stories could get, let's look at one specific piece of spy tech from the anime. In the second episode, Loid is shopping with Anya when the clerk gives him a 10p coin as change, saying ribbit at the end of every sentence. On the way back, Loid remarks,
"A T, no, an F cipher."
While it focuses on the coin. When he gets home, he takes a needle to the side of the coin, opening it up and revealing a tiny sheet with sets of 5 numbers. From this code, he gathers information as to a mission for that Saturday. What he reveals inside of that coin is a message coded with a cipher, in this case the specific type being communicated by ribbit, the sound of a frog, hence F cipher. Ciphers are pretty complex, and there's one real example which worked something like this. Each word of the original message is converted to a set of 4 numbers from a specific sheet with the code called a one-time pad. 1 number from the first string is added to the second, 2 from the second to the third, and so on moving forward. A first string of 5 numbers is inserted, another set which denotes which page of the pad to use and allows the recipient to decipher the message. But further first, the sender takes these second strings and onwards from the pad, adding each string to the corresponding place in the message with non-carrying arithmetic, so 8 plus 8 would give you 6 rather than 16. This is then converted into a group of letters based on another given formula, leaving the message as strings of 5 letters. The next unused string from the pad is converted in this same way and added to the end of the message to signal that it has concluded. This is then the message that can be sent somewhere else, where the recipient will reverse all of these steps to decode it. If it sounds excessively complex, well, it was, but it was actually kind of justified. This is taken from a cipher that an American team was actually working to decode. The number of steps and different given formulas which could only be determined from specific sheets, only to be used once, then destroyed, made sure there was as minimal information as possible to go on if your enemy did happen to intercept a message. There was a lot of paranoia, as you can see, but because both sides were doing so, it ended up actually being justified. But this code isn't the only real aspect of this scene. The coin itself is something else actually used during espionage in the Cold War, down to the needle being used to open it. In New York City in 1953, a paperboy needed change for one of his deliveries. Two elderly women across the hall split a $1 bill for him, leaving him with a handful of change, including one nickel which felt oddly lighter than the rest. The boy dropped it and it split open, revealing a tiny photograph with a long series of sets of 5 numbers. Through a telephone game between one of the boy's friends and her father, the FBI got involved, where it was examined closer. The nickel was actually made of 2 separate nickels, one 1948 minted and another during World War II. It wasn't made of actual nickel due to the current shortage. In the R of "In God We Trust" text, there was a small hole where a needle would be inserted to pry the coin open. Now, unfortunately, without knowing the specific code of the F cipher mentioned in the anime, we can't decode what the message actually says. But aside from that, the only thing about this scene that isn't real is the point Loid opens the coin from, which is just a downright nitpick. It's only a minute or so of the anime, but knowing it's not simply some made-up world building, but actually elements based on real occurrences is a pretty neat fact, and one done very casually and naturally. But the story of the hollow nickel goes further than that and will keep going down its path because it can corroborate more of the anime's espionage elements. Now, the FBI was taking the nickel quite seriously. They compared the typeset of the little sheet against every typewriter in their database. Yes, they had a typewriter database, but they got no matches. This led them to believe and correctly assume it was foreign made. They called on former communist bloc intelligence defectors for help, but none of them had applicable information for the cipher. They even compared it against other hollow or trick coins to see if they could find any distinguishing tool markings. Still, there was no luck. That is, until 1957, with the defection of a Soviet spy about to be recalled to Moscow. Now, this story is much more detailed than what I'll be getting into here, so as always, I encourage you to check out the pinned comment where you can find the sources used in this video for a much more better and much more detailed look. This one's actually from the FBI. Now, this spy was Romeo Operations, a teacher who was conscripted by the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, in 1939 because of his knowledge of the Finnish language. He was sent to combat zones there to translate documents and interrogate prisoners. Eventually, after World War II concluded, he was moved up the ladder and became respected enough for a more important mission. One which required him to be separated from his family, study the English language as well as the capture, coding, and decoding of messages, and assume a new identity in the United States. Now, the easiest way to enter the US was naturally as citizen, so he was given the identity of Eugene Nikolai Maki, an American-born citizen whose parents relocated to the Soviet Bloc in the 1920s. Heihan returned to Finland and assumed Maki's identity, where he lived for 3 whole years as an ordinary, hard-working citizen, and he even married a wife who knew him only as Eugene Maki. Using his Idaho birth certificate, Maki was able to receive a US passport, and in 1953 he returned to the United States. Here he was put in contact with his handler, a man he only knew as Mikhail. He and Mikhail would only meet when strictly necessary, usually in the Prospect Park subway station. More often though, they would communicate through carefully hidden messages. For example, to denote his arrival, Maki was instructed to place a red thumbtack on a signal post outside of the Tavern on Green in Central Park. If he thought he was under surveillance, he was to place a white thumbtack instead. If they needed to communicate, they would often utilize dead drops, the careful placement of information in a spot someone could only find if they were looking for it. Maki actually proved his story to the FBI agents by presenting them an unintentionally sabotaged dead drop. a hollowed-out bolt in the steps of Prospect Park containing a message was stuck when a repair crew re-cemented the stairs. 2 years after it was initially dropped, the agents dug it out, corresponding Maki's claims. Now we can finish connecting the dots you've probably already put in place. As an interesting note is the meeting place of the Prospect Park subway station, which could have been an influence for Loid's contact in episode 12, although it's likely more of just a neat coincidence. But the same scene gives us something else, an instance of drops in the anime. Now, technically what we witness in the series are live drops, which is a direct interaction rather than the incognito passing of information. The two people actually meet. However, one technique displayed in the anime, placing the orders to be received on a drink which the agent would then purchase, could have been used as a dead drop technique, albeit a riskier one. But it stands as an example of something which no one would question. The woman even states that this has been her everyday life for years. Loid likely purchases from that spot every time he passes to give it that much more legitimacy. It would be documented by the secret police, but only as a regular activity of his, and eventually they'd start ignoring it. It's playing around the absolute paranoia levels of surveillance occurring both in the anime and real world at the time. It also brings in a neat element of East German culture that's persisted until this day, the Spati. In East Germany, stores were required to close very early for what we experience today, leaving those who worked late shift without any real options for shopping. This led to these kiosks popping up all over the country, literally named or roughly translated as late shops for the purpose they served. They became meeting grounds where all kinds of people gathered to buy a drink, pick up a small convenience, or hang out when other shops or bars had closed. They actually persist in this sort of fashion today, with many people having a favorite location they'll frequent for the atmosphere or the culture behind it. We can also see an example of this earlier in the anime when Loid receives information from Frankie at a tobacco stand. Not quite an element of espionage, but a cool note nonetheless. While we're on drops and food though, I'm going to look at another example from the anime. In episode 6, Loid asks Yor and Anya if they're okay with eating out that night, and they agree. At the restaurant they go to, Loid orders the special, and they bring him the absolutely alliterative
pork sauté in a pawpaw sauce with porcini mushrooms and a potato potage.
This leads him to gather a message in the peace cipher, which is literally written on the food in sauce, which he decodes to provide him with the details of his next meeting. While not quite so elaborate as having it spelled on the food, we have seen occurrences like this in the real world. Now, this isn't an example from the Cold War, however, it likely occurred then as well. And I say we can guess this because a former CIA operative, active in the mid to late 2000s, stressed restaurants as the lifeblood as espionage for many reasons. From easy back exits to how natural they would feel or how crowded or empty they could be, they made for the least conspicuous meeting spots. Just make sure they're not in a f***ing basement. In one specific experience she documented, she received word to communicate with her contact via messages taped to the inside of a toilet tank of a local restaurant. There, she found a note which read, "Order the French fries." She did, and along came an order of fries with chopsticks and a side of hot sauce as part of the message, and a waiter who was obviously an ally. This one was one I was wholeheartedly expecting to be detached from reality, just something funny made up from the anime, but this ridiculous message passed along in Spy Family actually mirrors some real-world occurrences. Now, there's a few elements of the anime that may seem like contrivances to force along comedic moments, but are actually rooted in some reality. The plot itself reads like one of these, as the entire reason for Loid and Yor's relationship is to keep up appearances. A single father would never have a child admitted to the prestigious academy Desmond's son attends, so they make their odd arrangement to help both sides out, providing a mother and a husband for their respective stories. In the final episode of the season, we see some gossip from their neighbors, which attempts to cast doubt on this perfect family they're living the lie of. They say that Loid's exhaustion must be from money trouble, and the fact he's out late is probably a sign that he must be cheating. This sends him into a panic, as any suspicion cast on him for not being an ideal citizen is an exceptional threat to the mission. We'll get into detail on why if I'm able to make another part of this series on Yuri, but the basics you have to know is that appearances were exceptionally important for spies in general, but particularly in East Germany. It was an aggressive surveillance state with a secret police that was desperately trying to justify its eyes and ears everywhere. So they investigated everything and anything. He rushes to be the perfect father after this to try and mend the gaps forming in his appearance that could blow the whole thing wide open. We can witness this with Maki's story, given he spent 3 whole years living as someone he wasn't before even starting the mission, but since he went to the US and not the other way around, let's move on to another example of someone actually in East Germany. Only called M, our second man was a spy for the Dutch and later on the CIA from the 1960s onwards. Working for an international company already, M had the perfect cover for frequent travel, especially behind the Iron Curtain, where he spent a lot of time. Why was that? Well, he was actually a double agent. He was recruited by East German intelligence and used this to gather information for his Western loyalties. While in the Soviet Bloc with his 2 handlers, M and his comrades formed genuine bonds, eating expensive meals and drinking aged cognacs between trips to fancy bathhouses, while M was given countless gifts for his great performance. They were genuine friends, it seemed. However, he was constantly on edge in trying to keep up appearances. His handlers knew he was married, but one night still offered to provide him with female companionship. Now, this could have been an innocent enough offer and something people definitely engaged in. But what if it wasn't? What if they were really testing to see if he was loyal to his wife and thus loyal in general? Essentially, they might have been testing if he was an ideal citizen. He was constantly on edge as every interaction could have been a test like this. At one point, they even recited a line he told to the CIA back to him in English, leading M to become mentally tortured wondering if, or in his mind when, they turn on him. Luckily, M survived, but not without his scars. His time as a spy left him with a mental breakdown, and the agencies he worked for refused to provide any assistance in providing him the specific mental care he needed being a former spy. And throughout the entire journey, he found himself exhausted, returning home to his wife with absolutely no energy. As it was described, all this time he would have to pay attention to every detail, however small, and make sure that he didn't betray himself as a double agent by a careless remark or gesture. You'll probably note these similarities to Loid's story. With what we've already covered, he has to be exceptionally concerned with his image at all times, being acutely aware of what those around him think, constantly with an eye over his shoulder. He literally has a document in his pocket that proves him as someone he isn't. That's kind of stressful. And things like the Aquarian trip aren't just excuses to say get penguins into the anime, although we do appreciate that. It's actually the kinds of stunts he would have to have been required to pull for appearance's sake. But we can also see his exhaustion, both in the first episode and finale, is more than just an excuse to move the plot or put in some easy jokes. It's something actually experienced, as spies were essentially required to keep up their act 24/7. Even when Loid is relaxing at home, he's still living with 2 people who know him as someone he isn't. Well, in reality it's just 1, but to him it's 2. There's not a single moment where he can let himself slip up like what we see in M's story. There's also a line in his introduction:
Although you won't receive any medals or public fanfare, your blood, sweat, and tears make everyone else's day-to-day lives possible.
which is more than what it seems on the surface. Sure, because he's a spy, he wouldn't receive any recognition, it's supposed to be secretive, but there's more to this line than just that. One of the reasons M spoke out about his time as a spy was his bitter feelings towards the agencies which abandoned him after 22 years of service. Years later, M was granted access to his BVD file, where it was specifically stated from his superiors that he was not to receive any additional rewards or special presents due to his declaring too many expenses. Meanwhile, his companions behind the Iron Curtain showered him with gifts, from medals and congratulations for his services to expensive trips. They would even take him to toy shops where he could indulge his love for model trains, a reward completely specific to him, and they paid for it. He even received a meeting with Marcus Wolf, the head of the HVA. Now, they did at one point falsely interrogate him as a test of his loyalty, so take all this with that in mind, but he still stressed the difference between these kinds of gifts and rewards from the ones he was deceiving, and the lack of anything from the ones he was actually helping. This puts a bit of a new spin on Loid's situation. It isn't just that he was a spy and can't be recognized, it's that at times the West was much less likely to reward those who served it. The East was big on ceremony and congratulation, methods of keeping up strong appearances. We even see this with Anya in Eden Academy. The stars they gift students with to mark achievement isn't just the anime's way of making progress visible or building tension against it, it's more or less in line with the mentality of the Soviet Bloc. they wanted to make it a point to reward those seen as exceptional or more ideal citizens, both to bolster the jealousy for others, driving them to want to receive such special treatments that didn't actually really exist, and also to keep up appearances for the outside world to make it look like there were a lot of people to be celebrated in their culture. It all really feeds back into a culture of appearance in a society which was anything but what they wanted to make it seem, which is why it's so fascinating to me. But that's more to be left for the other two videos. Now, those were some more abstract or societal details, so let's get back into specific spy gear and techniques. In the very first episode, we see Anya discover Loid's spy equipment, including a communications briefcase. When opened, it contains a set of headphones and all the equipment necessary to transmit Morse code, tapped out with the attached pad. While this may seem like an outlandish piece of tech designed for the anime, it's actually based on something utilized in World War II. Operated by Virginia Hall, the Type 111 Mark II radio was used to send intelligence reports without the need for a constant location by Morse code. However, it wasn't quite as easy as it looks in the anime, as it was required to be hooked up to a bike frame connected to a car battery to power it, but we can assume there were a few advancements made between 1944 and the time Spy Family is in. Loid also utilizes one of the staples of the spy world, bugs. Whether planted on someone's person or hidden in their home or workplace, bugs were small listening devices used to record conversations and transmit them to a receiver, where they could be monitored for any suspicious action. I don't think this one needs too much detail, as we all know about bugs at this point, but it's fascinating to know East Germany was absolutely swarming with bugs, to the point where any citizen with even an ounce of suspicion placed on them couldn't converse even in their own home, because it was likely bugged in multiple locations. They were also placed on the person, as Loid does with Yor. However, those models were something more of the 80s, which feels a bit late for the Spy Family timeline. But eventually they did exist and could be fairly easily dropped on someone's personing for some incognito listening. They were pretty smartly incorporated into seemingly normal objects, say like a felt tip marker, which could then conveniently be forgotten where an important conversation is just about to happen, or included in something given to someone else as a very generous gift. And for one last spy technique, we can look back to episode 5, where Loid takes Anya on a reward trip to keep her spirits high while they wait for a response from the prestigious Eden Academy. They go to a castle which has been retrofitted to be an amusement park to provide us with the most anachronistic experience of the entire anime. But there, Wise, the organization Loid works for, gathers a whole host of spies at his request so they can act out Anya's fantasy of her father being Bondman, the main character of her favorite animated series, Spy Wars. This puts Loid in an awkward situation. He has to explain to these spies why they're doing this without blowing his cover to Anya or Yor. He manages to pass his message along via Morse code, tapping out his real intentions as he speaks to them about his false ones. Clearly no easy task, it proves his skill as a spy, more so as he succeeds and saves Anya from the villain. This is one that's a bit of a stretch for actual human capacity, but it is still based on real methods of covert communication. While Morse code could be used for this, the distinction between dots and dashes gets hazy through tap alone, so most times something else called tap code was instead utilized. This was a method of communicating via taps, letter by letter, using 2 digits for each letter. With this chart memorized, one would be able to turn the number of taps in each set into a letter, repeating the process for words and sentences, with X acting as the end of a sentence. For example, 2 taps, a pause, and then 3 taps would designate the letter H. Now, finding specific documentation of this specifically used during the Cold War was difficult, however, it was entirely possible as it existed before this point. It's also just not a very of-note method compared to the rest we've already covered, and would easily be written off as background noise in the right situation, which is what made it effective. But it is well documented in the Vietnam War, where American prisoners of war would use it to maintain communication and morale among each other. For those attempting to deceive the guards during interrogations, it allowed them to keep their story straight without direct communication, and it could be used silently between 2 people sitting next to each other, as one could just tap directly on their companion. This allowed them to maintain communication even when under pretty direct supervision. Now, we haven't addressed the elephant in the room yet, the defining aspect of Spy Family, fake families. To quickly restate, the arrangement is made between Loid and Anya first, that she's always been his daughter, and forged documents prove this. Yor comes in second under this assumption, and they make an arrangement which relies on that previous one. Yor acts as his wife to help Anya get into and stay in Eden Academy, and then Loid acts as her boyfriend and eventually husband to quell the worries of her overprotective brother Yuri. While Yor is in on part of the lie, the man she marries isn't exactly who he says he is. He's a spy living a false identity, tutoring aspects of himself to the mission and the culture around him, and attempting to blend in as the ideal citizen. He's definitely genuine with her, but this fact can never be forgotten. It's built on a lie. We can even see Loid's distaste for fake relationships in the first episode, where he carelessly dumps the daughter of his target once the mission no longer requires her. While he's a good guy overall, part of what he's doing here is just based on false persona. This is where we can look at something that isn't quite an exact match, but a relatively close one about fake relationships and even marriages spies utilized during the Cold War. This was mostly employed by the Stasi, but the agents utilizing romance and seduction were dubbed Romeos. This was an intricate process requiring many levels of deception. First, a target would be identified, normally a woman with some sort of clearance for or connection to classified intelligence. Normally, these operations would begin after a breakup or when the woman seemed most vulnerable, say after the death of a family member. Moles would embed themselves in the friend groups of these women, taking note of their interests and tastes in men. This information would then be passed along to the Romeos, who would alter their story, personality, and interests to match up with what these women desired. Then the Romeo would act, oftentimes following a template scenario like the fellow single vacationer or the helpful neighbor to strike an in. Once in, they would try to gather information from the woman or even convince them to spy themselves based on this emotional connection. One specific story, that of Gabrielle Klein, reveals just how extensive the preparation could be. Now, she was once in love with a math teacher who had blonde hair and blue eyes, something they learned from their mole, so the Romeo sent in had these same features, and his cover story was that of a physicist working for a peace institute. The match was so perfect, in fact, that Klein described the moment he approached her on the banks of the Rhine River as such. He looked like my dream man, and I thought, if I could ever meet such a man, I would be so happy. I fell in love with him the minute he came towards me. Just 3 months later, they were engaged. Many targets of Romeo shared a similar sentiment that their unknown false lovers were one of, if not the best relationships of their lives, both physically and emotionally. They knew how to act, where to go, what to say, and it was stressed that they were to listen with empathy. Acting under a new persona, their entire purpose was to make their targets feel as special as possible, building a bond they would do anything for. This bond was then manipulated into making them do anything from passing along information to becoming spies for countries they actively hated. Clearly, what we see in Spy Family isn't insidious like this, but it's based on some real and dark and interesting history, the fake romances of the Cold War. And that's about it for this first part of what will hopefully turn into a nice series, the genuine techniques and technology utilized by Loid in Spy Family. We had some obvious points and some that were genuinely surprising to me. That said, I'm sure others more knowledgeable than me spotted even more aspects, so let me know if I missed anything or what was the most shocking aspect that you learned today. For me, it was definitely the Romeos. I'd seen a little bit of that, but with some of the specifics of those stories and how kind of messed up they were, my jaw hit the floor. But as I said, there's 2 more potential parts of this topic, which I think explore even more interesting aspects of East Germany, specifically the pressures placed on women in a surveillance state and during the Cold War, which perfectly represents the failures of Soviet-controlled Germany. And there's also the surveillance state itself in the form of the Stasi, one of the most extensive and brutal secret police forces in history. Let's give you a quick teaser of just how messed up these guys were. These are the kinds of people who wouldn't just bug your house and listen in, but would continuously break in and move objects around to make their targets believe that they were going insane. You can probably see why I'd love to tackle those aspects as well. But if you want more Soviet history and anime, the video on screen now is about Black Lagoon's Balalaika and how she pretty perfectly characterizes the downfall of the Soviet Union after its war in Afghanistan. But I'll leave you as always by thanking the very generous patrons above me, but also everyone alike for spending a bit of your time with me here today. I hope you'll do so again sometime soon.